For our second lecture, we'll talk about pollution and the many components that affects wildlife in our hippo story. Next time we'll also talk about global warming as another offshoot of a pollution story. But today we'll talk more about the direct components of it. Pollution is the act or process of polluting or the state of being polluted. It's awful to use the word in its own definition, but it can be also defined as the contamination of soil and water or the atmosphere by the discharge of harmful substances. And these substances can harm dependent organisms, include wildlife species. We'll focus on a few pollution problems facing wildlife and a few solutions. There are both natural and man-made toxins. Natural examples may include the gases given off during decomposition in swamps. Human or man-made examples are what we're really going to focus more on, and those include those that come from industry or agriculture. Pollution and its resulting problems is nothing new, and our attempt to eliminate these problems have been ongoing. During the 1960s and 1970s, when society at large became concerned with environmental protection, many laws protecting the environment were enacted, including several whose goals were control and eliminate pollution. One law was the Clean Water Act. It was originally enacted in 1972, amended again in 77 and in 82. The Clean Water Act seeks to eliminate the discharge of pollutants in toxic amounts and make sure that water is safe for people to fish and to swim in. Another act was the Clean Air Act, first enacted in 1970 and amended in 1990. Under its provisions, every stationary and mobile pollution source must comply with emission standards as a means of improving air quality. Improved automobile control systems were required to meet more stringent standards. Filtration systems and scrubbers required coal-burning plants to burn more cleanly. So this cleans the air, all these around the surrounding areas. Pesticides are chemical agents used to kill unwanted organisms. We learned about that a bit in our invasive species section. These chemical agents are not only harmful to the organisms in question, many have proved to be harmful to people as well. Broad-spectrum pesticides kill many organisms, not just one. Insecticides kill all insects, not just the bad ones. So it's something of concern. Originally, many plants evolved with their own chemical defenses to prevent being chewed upon by herbivores, including insects, and scientists were able to extract those early on to make early forms of chemicals that could be used to protect crops from pests. But today, all of that has become synthetic, and there's always the concern about what impact does that have on the environment. There are, of course, advantages, distinct, definite advantages to using pesticides. Pesticides increase resistance to and protection from diseases. Insects or fungus can wipe out a crop, or mosquitoes can infect a village with malaria. Increasing the protection of crops results in higher yields, which is important economically, but also socially, especially in areas where food resources are limited. So there are real advantages. But of course, with the good comes the bad. So let's talk about 7 different disadvantages of pesticides. First, the impacts are poorly understood or known. The effects of the interactions between the chemicals and between the chemicals and the environment is what particularly is not well known or understood. We never know what impact there could be on the trophic chain. Second, chemicals can be quite mobile. They do not stay where they're administered. Chemicals can be carried by the water or the air. It was Rachel Carson, again, who wrote about Silent Spring, about DDT and killing birds and making a silent spring. So that is of concern, and we never know exactly what the implications could be. 3 is the word bioaccumulation, the concept of bioaccumulation, it's the buildup of a pesticide in an organism's body. That's a little scary that that could happen. As you take in those pesticides, it could slowly accumulate more and more in your body until it reaches some kind of toxic level. The other thing along those same lines is something called biological magnification or biological amplification. And the idea behind this is that, well, animals feed on other animals. And so those pesticides, those chemicals can accumulate in increasing concentrations as you move up the trophic ladder. So, for instance, you can look at this figure of DDT, and it's working its way up the food chain. So again, DDT we learned about. It's this colorless insecticide that kills on contact. It's poisonous to humans and animals when swallowed or absorbed through the skin. And it was banned in the United States because of what it was doing to wildlife species starting in 1972. But it's not gone from the land. It is slowly disintegrating, but it is not gone. So its effects are still to be seen. But we can look in this graph at the DDT concentrations. They may be really low in the water, 0.000003 parts per million. But as it's incorporated into the body of organisms in each successive trophic level, the concentration increases up to 10 million times the concentration originally found in the water. As a result, predators at the top have the highest level of pesticides in their body. Great example of biological magnification, and hence why the raptors especially were so impacted by DDT. And of course, we've learned about the example of our bald eagle. They declined as a result of DDT, which caused the thinning eggshells and lower reproductive rates. But once DDT was removed, their populations slowly came back, and they were recently pulled off of the threatened and endangered species list and have made a real comeback. My fifth disadvantage of pesticide is the idea that new pests are created. So the idea is by controlling one pest species, it's possible we're actually creating a new one. New pests are created by removing a predator or a prey species from the ecosystem, and although one species may be a pest, it may actually be keeping another, more harmful pest under control. Never thought of that, did you? The sixth idea is genetic resistance. Genetic resistance chemicals can evolve very quickly due to very short lifespans. Some insect species reproduce hours after they're born and may live only a few weeks, and this short generation time and lifespan contributes to their ability to adapt and develop resistance to chemicals. So eventually, it's possible the pesticides will have no use whatsoever. 7. Environmental persistence. Many of the pesticides have a long environmental persistence and remain intact for decades. And this is because natural decomposers cannot break down stable and synthetic chemicals. And as a result, we just have to wait for the chemicals to break down themselves, wait for that half-life, which could be decades, centuries even, before they disappear from the landscape. That's a little scary. There are alternatives to pesticides. As we discussed when we talked about invasive and exotic species, biological control allows one to use naturally occurring diseases, parasites, or predators to control pests. That's pretty neat. But as we remember, this method does have its advantages and disadvantages. So it's just got to be taken with a grain of salt. The biological control agents that are released need to be done carefully with a lot of research to make sure there's not secondary impacts that are going to be caused. Second is something called integrated pest management, or IPM, and it relies on a variety of control methods, as its name implies. Integrated pest management includes a combination of chemical and biological and cultural mechanical methodologies that are specific to an area, and you just have to make it work as best you can. The important part, though, is that what we focus on with IPM is management rather than eradication. We recognize we can't get rid of everything, but if we do a combination of things, we might have much better control of it, management of it over the long term. So, for instance, here's some pictures of things that we might incorporate in an IPM situation if we're trying to control a pest species in an agricultural setting. So the first thing that one could do is in the top left-hand corner, you can do better tillage where you contour your tilling with the landscape to reduce soil erosion, or you increase tillage to disrupt pests from becoming established. When you interplant crops, each one of those colors is different crops, say corn and soybeans and milo or rye. The interplanting of crops also helps disrupt the movement of insects and can really slow down agricultural outbreaks, insect outbreaks. You can also use mechanical methods such as the bottom left-hand corner, which is actually a giant vacuum cleaner. You can drive that over your crops and pull insects off. Or if you were dealing with fruit trees, you could build screens on the buildings to prevent mosquitoes from reaching people. On the top right-hand side, you can think about the idea of pheromone traps, which contain natural insect hormones and attract insects and pull them away from crops. In the bottom right-hand corner is the idea about just don't forget about chemical controls. Sometimes we just have to use a pesticide, but as long as you're trying to use other things as well, in combination, you can hopefully use less pesticides and do it less often. So ultimately, we're doing something reasonable to reduce pesticide buildup in the environment. Third is the idea about genetic engineering. It's when there's recombinant DNA technology that alters the genetic makeup of an organism. The goal is to confer resistance or add nutrients or work with specific herbicides or pesticides that are targeted to a specific species. You may have heard of a thing called Bt corn, Bacillus, which is a soil microorganism. Bt corn's been engineered to be resistant to insects. What they did is they took a gene from the soil microorganism of Bacillus, and it's been incorporated into the genetic code of corn that allows it to produce a toxin, which the Bacillus naturally does, and then it kills the insects that feed on the corn. The idea sounds good to some people, but a little bit like Frankenstein's to others, so sometimes we'll call it Frankenfoods. The real question is it safe? Well, it's a really good question. I mean, we have a case where we're conferring resistance and we're really improving the quality of the corn, and it's going to hopefully also work with some specific Bt-specific pesticides as well, or herbicides. But is it safe? What effects could it have on butterflies that feed on the Bt corn, for instance, as compared to the European corn borer, which is the main driver of eating the corn, and the bacillus will tend to stop? Or what about humans that eat the corn? I don't know. That's a real question that we're trying to figure out. A lot of people are concerned, but much of the food, unfortunately, has already been genetically altered to some degree. And that's something you have to give some thought to. Look at the graph. There's a series of different species. So a soybean genetically modified, 2 types of corn, 2 types of cotton, and you can see how prevalent they are. So for instance, the purple is the Bt corn that we just talked about. It is now in upwards of 40% of corn in 2007. I'm certain that's probably gone up to 60% at this point. It's a very common component of all corn. So you most likely are eating Bt corn and you never knew it. Hopefully, there really are no implications. The fourth idea, sorry, I wrote one there. For the fourth idea to alternative to pesticide is organic farming. Organic farming is an ecological management system promoting and enhancing biological diversity. Before 2002, the term organic was loosely applied to produce, but now the USDA regulates the condition that can earn this seal. You can see that up in the top right-hand corner. Organic farming uses little or no off-farm inputs, off-farm, things you're bringing in from the outside, meaning no synthetic fertilizers or pesticides. Organic farmers might actually use things called pull crops, where they plant a crop nearby that actually pulls the insects away from the core crop that is where all the real money is. Or maybe from a nutrient perspective, use manure instead of fertilizers. All of these things can potentially lead to organic farming. Some argue that organic products taste better or they're more nutritious, but unfortunately none of these claims have actually ever been proven. Some argue that they are safer, and maybe there's something to that, just because you're removing the pesticides and herbicides from the environment. But to be on the safe flip side, there have also been studies that say if you just really wash your produce really well, traditional produce with pesticide and herbicides, there's a pretty good chance that you remove most of those pesticide residues. Um, but if you're dealing with at-risk segment of the population, maybe children or the elderly or immunocompromised, this might be worth doing just to do anything you can to reduce any potential risk and stress from pesticides in your body. So, but of course, the real benefit of organic crops tends to be environmental, not so much in the human health component. You can see in these two graphs that how much it has increased in recent years on the right-hand side. That's just U.S. organic food sales up to 2010, and it's gone great guns over that time. And part of it is, there's two reasons for this. One is just it's more popular and more environmental consciousness about this, but the other is cost. On the left-hand side, just for instance, corn prices of organic, the prices have come way down. They used to be really high just due to the fact that it cost farmers more. The few farmers that were doing it cost them more to do it. And now more and more are doing it. The cost is coming down. So it's reasonable that organic foods are going to become more accessible to larger segments of the population. I wanted to talk about a few other case studies about pollution that we need to give some consideration to. The first is acid deposition. Acid deposition is a type of air pollution that includes acid that falls from the atmosphere to the earth as precipitation or as dry acidic particles. Sulfur oxides, SOXs, and nitrogen oxides, NOXs, are released into the atmosphere where they react with water, oxygen, and other chemicals to form acidic compounds. The compounds include sulfuric acid and nitric acid that return to land and water. If you remember your chemistry labs from high school, we always had to wear gloves and goggles to handle the acids, right? The chemicals. Human-generated sources of sulfur and nitrogen oxides are released into the atmosphere include power and industrial plants, as well as mobile emissions. They are carried by the wind, and once in the atmosphere, chemical reactions occur forming sulfuric and nitric acid. And these acid compounds then return to the earth as particulates in dry deposition or through precipitation as acid rain. Now, pH measures acidity on a scale from 0 being very acidic to 14 being very basic. Remember this from high school? Pure water is, in theory, right at number 7, neutral. Normal rain is slightly more acidic as it mixes with other chemicals in the atmosphere, but acid rain is really bad where it goes to 4.5. Some sources of pollutants and acid deposition are natural, including volcanoes and forests. However, most are anthropogenic or human-caused, which include volatile organic compound, or VOCs. VOCs are chemicals that easily vaporize and enter the atmosphere. VOCs can be found in paint thinner, dry cleaning solvent, some chemicals in gasoline, and even trees, along with industrial and transportation exhaust, and the emissions from electrical power plants. How big of a problem is acid rain? It's a good question. This map shows the pH of rain in the United States. Where do you see the most acid rain? That is the redder colors. Well, it's here in the Northeast. And now why do you suppose that is? Well, the Northeast is the most populated, so that could result in high levels of anthropogenic sources. But think about the usual weather patterns across our country. The jet stream usually blows from west to east. So it is actually the power plants in the Midwest that release the compounds that fall as acid rain on us. There are certainly effects of acid rain on humans, and while you will not suffer any direct detrimental effects on your health, the particulates may end up settling in the lungs, increasing possibility of heart and lung disorders, such as asthma or bronchitis. But of course, we also see it more commonly as effect on buildings, for instance. It corrodes metals, or building materials like granite or lime. And so you can see these cases, for instance, where these statues are becoming sort of muddled as they are being worn away. Acid deposition has serious effects on wildlife and biodiversity as it alters the pH of aquatic environments. As we discussed before, many species have a narrow range of tolerance, including a tolerance for pH levels as well. As those levels change, some species may not survive. The link between acid deposition and declining aquatic animal population is well established. Although fish have received a good deal of attention in regards to acid deposition, other animals and plants are adversely affected as well. So, for example, here we see a graphic depicting the ranges where many species are most commonly seen. Water boatmen, it's an insect, have a very wide pH tolerance, anywhere from 3.5 really acidic to 6.5 neutral. In contrast, freshwater mussels have a very narrow pH tolerance, somewhere between 6 and 6.5. The freshwater mussels would have the greatest difficulty adapting to changes in the pH level in the environment if you have a lot of acid deposition to it. This may explain why 70% of all the freshwater mussels are listed as threatened and endangered in the US, not to mention our previous story as well about zebra mussels being a huge impact in the Great Lakes. Acid deposition also, probably more importantly, destroys forests. It impacts vegetation and wildlife habitats. Acid deposition can also directly impact wildlife species itself. In fact, about 50% of certain forest species are damaged, which may be a step toward eventual death, increasing stress, right? The signs of damage include reduced growth, but some conifer species show yellowing of the needles, as you can see in the picture on the left. And these signs of forest declines are usually seen in higher elevations, which are closer to the cloud layer that's getting the highest level of acid deposition. Birds living in these areas lose the trees they use for cover to build their nests, to roost, and to escape from predators. Now, several studies have also found that birds in areas with a lot of acid deposition lay eggs with really thin eggshells, which are likely to break or dry out before they actually hatch. And this results from reduced calcium availability in the environment due to the interaction of calcium with the chemicals in acid rain. The acid rain dissolves the calcium slightly, making them thinner. So what is being done? There are EPA programs that limit and reduce sulfur and nitrogen oxide emissions in industry. These programs also focus on human health issues. There are federal laws that regulate what the maximum allowable levels of certain toxins may be released. And so, of course, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act are great examples of folks and acts that are there to monitor the level of these pollutions. And of course, you can help too. Proper maintenance of vehicles reduce unhealthy emissions from your car. And you can reduce your consumptions of fossil fuels altogether by taking a bus or commuting. There's simple things like turning off lights and appliances when you're not in use, or turning out a thermostat a few degrees each winter, which can reduce your electricity use and actually cut down on emissions. A second case study that I wanted to talk about was mercury. It's another toxin in the environment that can really cause problems for wildlife. Mercury occurs naturally and also through industrial pollution. It can move through the air into water through precipitation. Now, again, we see a chemical change occur. Bacteria cause chemical changes, transforming mercury into toxic methylmercury. Aquatic organisms absorb methylmercury. This begins its passage through the trophic structure. This graphic shows the mercury cycle. Mercury is released from anthropogenic sources, such as wastewater treatment, urban areas, industrial areas, mining, agriculture, and through precipitation or runoff, the mercury ends up in the water, where it undergoes a chemical transformation to methylmercury. So you're seeing mercury, Hg, turning into methylmercury, the CH3Hg. And that's absorbed by algae and passed through the trophic structure into invertebrates and vertebrates. The effects of mercury on an organism are unfortunately cumulative. It accumulates over time, it bioaccumulates, and causes damage to the nervous system. It can affect both aquatic and terrestrial wildlife, and with species higher in the trophic structure being more seriously affected. Rainbow trout suffer from growth inhibition and high mortality of embryos and larvae. Yellow perch and northern pike with which will have impaired kidney function and endocrine disruption. Scientists believe mercury is a factor in the increasing incidence of limb deformities in bullfrogs and northern leopard frogs. High mercury concentrations also have been shown to cause high embryo larval mortality. Loons, higher up in the food chain, the bird in the left-hand side, hatch fewer young, incubate eggs for less time, produce lighter eggs. In chicks, high mercury concentrations can affect the brooding or the feeding behavior that they engage in. Mercury contamination may be a contributing factor to the decline even of the Florida panther as they work their way further and further up the food chain. And that's a real concern when you're dealing with an endangered species that is struggling with other problems like habitat availability. What is the human health connection with wildlife and mercury? Well, low levels of mercury in the brain cause neurological problems such as headaches, depression, argumentative behaviors, but longer exposure in certain groups of people are more at risk. Exposure in pregnant women correlated with developmental delays, mental retardation, cerebral palsy in their unborn children. Exposure in young children resulted in memory, attention, and language development problems. Both men and women have suffered from infertility as a result of high blood mercury levels. Prolonged exposure seriously damages the kidneys and nerves and cardiovascular system. The problem is that nearly all fish contain trace amounts of methylmercury, but it is the long-living and larger fish species that feed on other fish that accumulate at the highest levels, right? So you go up the trophic chain, the trophic ladder, the predatory fish are going to bioaccumulate. And so there are species that have really high mercury levels: shark, swordfish, king mackerel, tilefish. These are things that are of concern. But that doesn't mean you need to avoid all fish and lose out on the good things of eating fish. It is a healthy thing. But women of childbearing age should not eat fish with the highest levels of mercury. They may eat up to 6 to 12 ounces of safer fish per week. And the safer fish include shrimp or canned light tuna, salmon, pollock, catfish, things like this. Albacore tuna has more mercury, so choosing the light tuna when possible or lower the amount you eat each week is a good thing. I put up this website which you can look at, run by the Food and Drug Administration, the federal government, with more information about mercury levels found in seafood. So if you like seafood, you can go to this website and you can pick out a few key things and see the mercury levels and recommendations for how much you think you can safely eat. One last thing that I want to share with you, another website that you could visit, was an article that is unfortunately a little old. It's 2007, but it's still active and up. You can go look at it. Done on the USA Today website. And what they do there's an interactive map where you can zoom in to wherever you live in the country, and it will show you sources of mercury. That is, like, where are the closest power plants or other sorts of things that are dumping out large amounts of mercury that's been recorded. And should you be concerned about mercury accumulation in your own body if you're surrounded by areas where there's a lot of release. So I found it a very useful graphic, and it talks more about the mercury story and human health. So you might want to take a look at that. All right, I'll stop there, and next time we'll talk about global warming as a last part about pollution, and then also we'll talk about human overpopulation. Thanks.